coronavirus has seen a massive increase in infections from 618 confirmed cases in March 2020 to 4.75 million in September 2020. India's COVID-19 cases are rising exponentially. Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu are leading the list of the country's worst affected states. It was in 1967 when the world encountered 2 million deaths with smallpox. But the human victory over the disease with a vaccine is a constant reminder of what we can do together. COVID-19 pandemic is a common threat, and the global community must battle it together. Scientists and doctors globally are working together across national boundaries to develop a potential cure for COVID-19. Human trials are still on for many in the third stage. There have been signs of a way out of this pandemic. The trials of the Oxford vaccine, which is at an advanced stage of testing, showed a positive immune response. But the latest adverse event with the Oxford University vaccine is a speed breaker in the development. The first human trial data in the US showed antibodies that could neutralize the virus. A group in China showed a vaccine was safe and led to protective antibodies being made. Also, the Russian vaccine has shown promise. There are many unique approaches to vaccine development and human trials. A vaccine would normally take years to develop, but the ability of technology has helped researchers reach the third stage of human trials at a breakneck speed. But the third stage of human trials cannot be sped up. After injecting patients, we have to see the reaction and then assess the body's response over a period of time. Most experts think a vaccine is likely to be available by mid-2021, about 12 to 18 months after the virus first emerged, but this is not set in stone. Adverse events can keep occurring and the virus will continue to mutate. Vaccine development for COVID-19 is a challenge to the world. The world has been pushed to a wall, isolating people and taking people back to the basics, where people realize immunity is key. That is possible only with robust body health. The world of science works in the background finding a cure, and the world must wait and take precautions for not spreading the virus. It will take global solidarity once the best vaccine is found to share data so that the vaccine with the best efficacy is used. Democracy News Live Bureau Report, New Delhi. Good evening, everyone. I welcome you to our show, It Matters. Democracy News Live's COVID-19 series is about the vaccine, and it focuses on staying away from the noise and finger pointing. It concentrates on getting the voices of the experts who are sitting at the epicenter of the development of the vaccine. Over 23.3 million cases of coronavirus have been reported globally, but 9,10,299 have died. Infections have been reported in over 210 countries since it was first declared in China in December 2019. The virus has attacked the economy and impacted our way of life. This has not only brought about substantial changes in people's standard of living, but has equally turned the economy upside down. According to Indian Council of Medical Research, 11,63,524 samples were collected for COVID-19 on September 10, 2020. The total number of tests conducted in the country has reached 5,40,97,975. Although there are several companies racing against the clock to figure out a potential cure for COVID-19, but till date, there is no credible medication or a vaccine. According to the Union Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, India's recovery rate now stands at 77.8%. India is now the second most affected country, as it surpassed Brazil, Russia, Peru, and the UK. I want to welcome our guest, Dr. Jerome Kim. He's an MD, Director General of International Vaccine Institute, is an international expert on the evaluation and development of the vaccine. He has strong scientific experience spanning basic research through advanced clinical development. Also joining us is Gagandeep Kang. She's a clinician, scientist, professor in the Department of Intestinal Sciences at the Christian Medical College, Vellore, India. She's a leading researcher with a major research focus on viral infections in children and the testing of rotavirus vaccines. She became the first Indian woman to be elected as a Royal Society Fellow. Thank you for your time, both of you. Let me start by asking you, Dr. Kim, how will the current vaccines protect against the virus that is constantly mutating?
So that is actually a fascinating question. And possibly the best way to think about it is when we sequence the virus, when we actually know the genetic information in the virus, we can actually compare how it's mutating, comparing the older strains to the ones that are circulating today. And we express that as in a way of measurement. So if you could consider the amount of genetic variation in the over 50,000 full-length sequences of COVID-19 that exists today, that would be a pinprick or the head of a pin. If you compare that to the amount of sequence variation in influenza in a single year, say 1997, it would be something about the width of my index finger. If you were to compare that to HIV, again, in a single year, in a single country, it would be something the size of Hong Kong. So when you consider the amount of mutation in COVID-19, you get an amount that is maybe 8 to 10-fold lower than you would see with the standard influenza in a given year. That would say that the amount of variation is not very significant, and hopefully that will mean that it will be easier to develop a vaccine that will work against several different strains of coronavirus circulating in the world today. We don't know that is the case yet. The clinical studies have yet to be done.
So let me get this straight. What you're saying is, because of the way this virus is developed, it possibly will be easy to attack multiple strains of the virus with a single vaccine?
Again, possibly. We know that at least in one of the studies that has been done to show protection using a vaccine in monkeys, that the defensive responses, the infection-fighting proteins that were generated by the vaccine, appeared to be able to neutralize both the original virus and the new, more active form of the virus that's being seen now, that's been seen in Europe, North America, and now in Asia.
You know, the Oxford vaccine study, the adverse impact we got on it. What is the general psyche around vaccine safety today?
So I think vaccine safety has always been in the forefront of what vaccine developers consider as they take a vaccine into human testing and eventually into marketing. And why is that? Because we give vaccines to healthy people to keep them healthy. So unlike a drug which is given to someone who is sick, and hopefully the drug makes them better, with a vaccine, we have a very high standard, as Dr. Kang has said. And we have to make absolutely sure that that vaccine protects against infection and is safe. The Oxford trial is on pause, and they're doing that out of caution. And it, to some extent, indicates that the safety mechanisms that we put into place to ensure participant safety in clinical trials is working. I mean, that's what we wanted to do. So they took some time off, they examined the case and its particulars, and then hopefully they'll come to a decision about whether to proceed or not. I think most of us suspect that the decision will be to proceed. And the other trials have similar safety nets in place in order, again, to ensure the safety of people who participate in clinical trials. And this is an ethical requirement, as well as a scientific requirement. And for those of us who recommend that people use vaccines, we want to make absolutely sure that these vaccines are safe and effective.
So is this going to, the Oxford adverse event, is it going to impact the timelines of the vaccine development, you think?
No, I think we're continuing to proceed as quickly as possible. None of the other trials were halted or paused when Oxford paused its trial. The idea here is that each of these vaccines is slightly different. The Oxford vaccine is based on a chimpanzee adenovirus. The Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are RNA. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is based on adenovirus type 26. The Chinese vaccines, and actually one of the Indian vaccines, is a whole inactivated virus vaccine. So each of them have slightly different characteristics as a platform and slightly different types of side effects that you might expect to see. And so I think the companies and the scientists conducting the studies are all very vigilant to ensure that volunteer safety in clinical trials is maintained.
Dr. Kim, when the world looks at vaccine development, I don't think they understand how different ways vaccine trials happen. Can you shed a little light on, what are the distinct ways? I don't want you to go into too much detail because a lot of the people will not understand the science behind it. But if you can take a little broad stroke view and explain what is the difference between RNA? I've heard of a term called vector. Explain that difference to me if you can.
Okay. So different kinds of vaccines. Originally, when we were just starting in all of this, and let's just take the smallpox vaccine, because smallpox was the prototype vaccine, and it's the one that eliminated a disease. Smallpox no longer exists in the world. Smallpox is actually smallpox vaccine is based on a virus called cowpox. And the cowpox virus infection protects against smallpox infection. So cowpox causes very mild disease in humans, but it protects you against a much deadlier disease, a disease that could kill 20 or 30% of the people who were infected. So that was the prototype vaccine. As we became more sophisticated, as people developed the germ theory, we were able to isolate the germs that cause disease, either bacteria at first and then viruses. And one of the first things they did was they killed it. They just used heat or formalin to inactivate the pathogen. And then they injected that into humans or into animals, and they showed that they could protect. Sometimes they were able to grow, or what we say, passage the virus, as the original Pasteur rabies vaccine was, grown and passaged in rabbits. And that allowed the vaccine to be used. So different types of vaccines have different origins. And as we've become more sophisticated, we've gotten to the point where we can take little pieces of genetic information from the virus and mass produce the protein that they make. And those make the protein vaccines that many of us have received, for instance, for hepatitis B. Other vaccines, like the RNA and DNA vaccines that are being tested now, don't actually have a licensed example. But they are vaccines that we are trying to develop. And the beauty in them is that they can be developed very quickly.
Okay, we have Dr. Kang back with us as well. Dr. Kang, do you think this whole the adverse event which was reported in Oxford, do you think it's going to impact timelines?
The trial has started again, and we hope that since follow-up of the people who have been recruited into the studies is continuing, it should not impact the timelines for that vaccine or for any other vaccine. I do hope that it will boost confidence in the public that everything possible is being done to ensure that patient safety is front and center.
Right. And just to, for the people to understand, these adverse events occur usually when you're doing these vaccine trials, isn't it?
Yes, they do. So, for example, in the rotavirus vaccine trial that we did, we had a run of seizures in one site with the vaccine, and we halted recruitment at that site for the rotavirus vaccine trial that was done in India. And after investigation, we found that it was really a heat-related event and resumed the trial, which went on to result in a vaccine that was licensed. These kinds of things happen all the time, and the Independent Data Safety Monitoring Board or Monitoring Committee is responsible for reviewing all the data and then making a call whether it is safe to proceed or not. That independence is very important. It is not the study investigators or the study sponsors who make the call whether to continue or not. It is people who are looking out for the safety of the participants and the integrity of the trial.
Dr. Kang and Dr. Kim, I want to, really thank you, first of all, for coming on a show like this and explaining, what's going on, because people have hundreds of questions. As I go out, and meet people, people have constant questions about what's happening with the vaccine. Where are we? Is this vaccine is out? Is it safe? What's going to be? How long is it going to be? Because you're coming and answering these questions really, puts people at rest, understanding, knowing what's going on. Now, Dr. Kim, there are a few vaccines like the Chinese and the Russian vaccine, if you want to call it that. Are they safe and ready for the market yet?
So I think your answer is in the continuing phase 3 trials of those vaccines. So although they have approval, they haven't been shown to be safe and efficacious. And for that reason, the companies are continuing to do the appropriate kinds of human clinical testing that is necessary in order to show that the vaccine actually protects against infection or disease and is safe. And it's when we have those data that a proper emergency use authorization or conditional approval or outright approval will be granted on the basis of the scientific information that's presented.
So, Dr. Kang, just to again, I think this is in continuation of the answer of Dr. Kim. How important is the safety and procedural protocols in vaccine development?
In every phase of testing, including after a vaccine is licensed, monitoring of safety is essential. When there are very rare side effects, you will not detect them even in large-scale phase 3 efficacy trials. One example of that is the narcolepsy that was seen after the H1N1 vaccines were used in Scandinavia. Another example of that is the fact that intussusception as a safety event was not detected in trials of up to 60,000 children for the Merck and GSK products that are now in the market. However, with post-marketing surveillance, it was possible to detect a signal which is as low as 1 in 20,000 to 1 in 100,000 children. Safety is paramount. We have to continue it through every stage of testing and after licensure.
So, a lot of people again have asked me this question, and I will ask it to you, is how large are third stage trials? I know a lot of we've reached second stage and we're going into third stage now. How many people does it involve? Dr. Kim, you can answer that. Sure.
I'm sorry, was that for me or for Dr. Kang?
Yeah, it's for you, Dr. Kang. How large, like what is the size of the population that you vaccinate and tested on? These are questions people have, and they constantly come and ask me. They said till second stage, we only,
I think people would be...
Sorry, go ahead.
I think people will be surprised by the tens of thousands of volunteers that are going to be necessary in each of the tests of the phase 3 tests of these new COVID-19 vaccines. There have been vaccine trials that have been in the 100,000 range. I don't think that we will be there, but certainly in the order of between 30 and 50,000 is what people are talking about now, which is why the companies are going around the world in order to find sites in order to do appropriate testing of the vaccines, both within their own countries and outside their countries. For instance, companies in China or Korea could not test the vaccine exclusively in their own countries because the rates of infection are not high enough. In a sense, unfortunately, you can test vaccines in countries or areas where the rates of infections are sufficient to be able to show as quickly as possible, as safely as possible, that the vaccine protects against infection and disease.
Yeah, so I think and a lot of the countries which were producing the vaccine saying, oh, the virus is no longer as prevalent there, it's died, so we'll have to go and test it somewhere else. And I think that was one of the issues around vaccine development as well. You need an active population with the virus. Now, will this reported adverse event be an advantage for anti-vaxxers to prove a point against vaccinations? Dr. Khan?
I think anti-vaxxers take whatever they can get and shape it to fit their message. It doesn't really matter whether it really is an associated event or not. They use the information that they have to deliver the content that vaccines are dangerous. The fact of the matter is that vaccines are among the safest products we have. All drugs, all vaccines, all medical products have some chance of side effects. No one will ever tell you who is informed about the process of testing that any product can be considered 100% safe. Whether that is a device, a drug, a vaccine, it doesn't really matter. There is nothing where you don't have to consider even a tiny, tiny, tiny risk. It will be there. What we try to ensure is that the benefit of using that drug, vaccine, or device really outweighs any risk that we can measure. And we make sure that the monitoring of safety continues as much as possible. But for anti-vaxxers who are on one end of the spectrum, it's very difficult to convince them that the testing process is so well controlled that what we deliver has quality, is safe, and is efficacious. I think it's important not so much for people who are at the extreme end of the spectrum, but to convince the general public that this is a solution, at least a partial solution to some of the problems that we are facing. And that's true for any drug, any vaccine.
Dr. Kim, can you tell us a bit about COVAX?
I'm sorry, the question was about COVAX?
Yes. Well, what is COVAX? We've heard that word thrown around a lot. I want to understand, and I think people want to understand what COVAX is.
COVAX is a really critical concept, and it's based on global solidarity around vaccines as a global public good. COVAX is an effort that is being led by CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, the World Health Organization, and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. Now, each of them has a separate role. The World Health Organization leads in policy, and the Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, is the provider of vaccines for global health around the world. Hundreds of millions of doses being sent to countries that can't otherwise afford vaccines. CEPI, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, are developers, the manufacturing experts. And we hope that with the combined effort of this group, the leadership of this group, with the 150 countries that have signed up for the COVAX facility, that the world will have 2 billion doses of vaccine available by the end of 2021. And that these doses of vaccine can be used to vaccinate a good portion of the population at greatest risk of severe outcomes, that is the elderly and potentially healthcare workers. So that hopefully, no matter whether a country is, the United States and high income, or, a country in sub-Saharan Africa, that there will be provision of at least some doses of vaccine in order to protect vulnerable populations. I think that, it's complex, it's important, and that is not happening over, unfortunately, but something like COVAX is what we need to ensure equity and access in vaccine distribution in COVID-19 pandemic.
And I think a lot of people have talked about global solidarity around this, and I think it's a very important one. Dr. Khan, I think the answer is kind of assumed, but I'll still, let you weigh in on this. Is it a good idea for India to join COVAX? I know the conversation is already on.
Yes, of course it is. There is no question. There is no solution to this problem unless it is a shared solution that is distributed everywhere. So whether it is India's participation as a recipient of vaccines from a global allocation, or India's contribution to the global pool to make sure that all of the world gets vaccines, there is no question that we should be participating.
Dr. Kang, now that we are seeing a new wave of infections globally, with your experience, do you have a sense when the cases in India will plateau?
I think you know that you've reached the top of a peak once it's over. Right now, we are still at a stage where cases are continuing to climb. And although there are a lot of modeling efforts that are predicting that there will be a plateau reached in some places this month, in other places next month, for India as a whole, it's currently a little bit difficult to predict when we are going to reach a peak. All I can say it is at some point in the future.
Dr. Kim, the many accuse, that global disease fighting is also a fiefdom of the rich, you know, richer nations having more access to the vaccines. I know you explained through COVAX and through Gavi how the distribution of vaccine to poorer nations will happen, equitably. But when people talk about, fiefdom of the rich, do you prescribe to that?
So, unfortunately, I think that you would just need to pick up the newspaper and you'd be able to see that the wealthier countries, for instance, the United States, countries in Europe, ha- Australia, have made their separate deals, advanced purchases or pre order of different vaccines, not knowing whether the vaccines work, but in order to ensure that when vaccines are shown to be safe and effective, that their populations will have access to these vaccines. It's inevitable, I suppose, that that would be the case. I think that what we need to work together for, and the reason we need COVAX, and the reason we need countries like India or China or the members of the European Union to step forward, is that there needs to be leadership in this. And there needs to be global commitment to vaccines for countries around the world. And that will only happen if we all work together with a common goal and a common belief that unless we are able to deal with COVID all over the world, no matter whether the country is wealthy or impoverished, then we will never truly have a global solution.
Right. One of the things that people have always talked about is whether the vaccines coming out of these companies are going to be safe, they're not safe. Is there tell us a bit about the vaccine development protocol, Dr. Kong, if you can address that. How do we know that the vaccines coming out of these companies are safe or not?
When we start vaccine trials in humans, there has already been preclinical testing of the vaccines done. That's usually done in animal model systems. And for certain kinds of vaccines, you already know that these vaccines are likely to be safe because similar vaccines have been evaluated in humans before. So, examples of this are the mRNA and DNA vaccines, where the platform technology has been used in hundreds, if not thousands, of people before. But when you start the study, you start it very cautiously. You take people who are healthy, who don't have comorbidities, whom you can make sure that if there is a safety signal, you will be able to detect it quickly. These studies are usually done in very small numbers. And if it is a new product, not only do you plan to do it in small numbers, you actually start with very few individuals. The first day, you might even do just one or two people and then wait and then watch them for a day and then recruit the next set of people. So even if the trials are being done in phase one in tens of participants, even that will be graded so that you make sure that you can capture any safety signals that come out. It's only when you have finished monitoring people for a reasonable length of time that you decide that you can go to the next phase. In every phase of testing, the first phase is safety by itself, the second phase is safety and an immune response, and the third phase is safety and efficacy. So, safety comes first, in every stage of vaccine testing. And that safety, as I mentioned previously, continues after licensure as well. There is, the safety protocols also are pretty intense. You keep people there for monitoring immediately after they've received the vaccine, and then you call them up and ask them a list of questions to make sure that they have not actually had any of these conditions, whether they tell them to you or not. So these are called unsolicited adverse events if they are reported without your asking, and solicited adverse events if you go through your list of questions and say, did you have this? Did you have this? Did you have this? So the monitoring, even for minor side effects, is a lot. And obviously, for anything that is considered a serious adverse event, the investigation is intensive.
Right, it must take a huge amount of work. Dr. Kang, this question again to you. How did China develop a vaccine so early in the pandemic?
I think one of the things that people have not recognized is how much China has been focusing on developing its vaccine industry over the last decade, decade and a half. The number of vaccine companies that are there in China, both those supported by the government as well as private companies, has grown enormously. The number of products that they have is increasing very rapidly. They have experience doing this, but why people don't recognize that there is a background to China making vaccines is that China has such a large population that much of their production is used within their country. Now China is looking at outside markets. In India, we have been using a Japanese encephalitis vaccine that has been made by China for well over a decade now. China now has a hepatitis E vaccine that might be useful for our populations. And the fact that they've gotten off really quickly to develop vaccines here is that they saw the disease and saw how big it was and got started with developing a vaccine as quickly as any international players, if not before. So this
Yeah,
is
I
not
will.
really surprising.
Sure.
And I hope
Sure. No,
that their vaccines.
no, Dr. Kang, and you're not the first person who's talked about this. And there was so much adverse, and negative publicity around the Wuhan lab. And then I was talking to a doctor in South India. She's also based out of Chennai, where you are. And she was a virologist, and she talked about if Wuhan lab didn't exist, we wouldn't have a vaccine this early on. And I think that's something to recognize. We as a global community possibly need to look at things together rather than beginning to, automatically have a negative response around the idea that everybody's trying to fight each other. I'm sure there are problems and those problems exist, but it doesn't have to permeate into every part of our existence. And I think this is one of our big challenges moving forward. Um, Dr. Kim, what do you think about the Russian vaccine?
So like all vaccines, the Russian vaccine will need to be shown in phase 3 trials to be safe and effective. It may work. It's an adenovirus similar to the adenoviruses that are being used by actually two different companies because they've used two different adenoviruses. But there is no reason why, in theory, that vaccine would not work. But you should make your judgments based on the science and not on your predictions of science. And so when the vaccine is shown to prevent infection and is shown to be safe, then I think, the Russian vaccine, like many others, should be available for global health for use by people in Russia and elsewhere. But I don't think that, vaccines should be political tools. This should be science. We already have questions about, whether vaccines are safe and effective, and it doesn't help if a vaccine without any safety data is approved. So I think, again, as we think through the longer term picture of vaccines and vaccine development for COVID-19, I think one of the lessons learned here is that we can accelerate vaccine development. We can do so with the same view to efficacy, that is, does the vaccine work, that we did before. We do have to pay special attention to safety because we are accelerating a process that would normally be 5 to 10 years, a process where we would have 5 to 10 years worth of time to look at safety. And then as Dr. Gang presented or discussed, you'll also need to evaluate the vaccine after it's been approved. So the work doesn't stop once the vaccine is shown to be safe and effective. There's a much longer period of time where we have to look at vaccine safety as something that is everyone's responsibility, and it's every country's responsibility, because there's no way that we can know whether the 6 or 7 different vaccines that are being tested now are going to be deployed in the future. And when they are, we could very well expect that different vaccines will have different side effects. So we really have to be careful. We have to strengthen those elements within countries that look at vaccine safety in order to ensure that those populations that receive these vaccines are going to have good outcomes in the long term as well as the short term.
Dr. Kim, so the Russian vaccine, do you think it was ethical for Mr. Putin to test it on his own daughter?
So that's an interesting question, but I would suspect that Mr. Putin is not the principal investigator on the trial. So if his daughter was provided with the information necessary to make a decision to participate in the trial, and she voluntarily signed what we call an informed consent, so that she acknowledged that there were potential risks in participating in the trial, and she signed. And if she's of age, which I believe she is, then it's perfectly reasonable for her to make a decision to participate in a trial to support the evaluation of this, evaluation for safety and immunogenicity of any vaccine, including Sputnik 5. So, again, we believe in informed consent. We believe that trials should be conducted ethically and scientifically in a scientifically sound manner. And if that is the case, then it's perfectly legitimate for her to participate out of her own free will.
And so what is age when you say if she's of age? What is age? What is that number?
So it depends on which country you're in. It could be 18, it could be 21. Depending on the type of trial, it can actually go lower than that as well. But again, depends a little bit on what countries consider to be the age of majority, the age where teenagers are able to make informed decisions about their own health.
Is it ethical for a company to vaccinate all their employees and with their candidate vaccine? Dr. Kang, if you can answer that.
I think exactly as Dr. Kim pointed out, you cannot force anyone to take a vaccine. If people have given informed consent for an investigational vaccine, it is acceptable to offer a vaccine that may have benefit as long as you explain the risks and make sure that any decision about taking the vaccine is made by the individual. It cannot be a decision made on behalf of the individual by someone else.
Dr. Kim and Dr. Kang, question to both of you. I'm sure you'll be excited to answer that. When will we have a vaccine? Dr. Kim, why don't you take that first?
So, I think we will have a vaccine. I think that this is a vaccine that is definitely possible. I think that we will potentially have information on whether the vaccine protects and some preliminary evidence on safety, potentially by, this quarter, between September and if there are sufficient numbers of infections. Maybe by early next year at the latest, the initial series of information may be available. Will we know for sure? Will there be enough certainty around the answer to be confident that this vaccine actually does that? Perhaps not. And so I think it's really going to be important to look at the data, to look at the numbers of infections, to look at the information that the companies can provide, and then make it.
So what you're saying is by the end of this quarter, we should have a vaccine. its efficacy and its adverse reactions and all of that, we would know by the mid of next year? Is that what you're saying?
No, actually. So I think if you separate vaccine into three phases, first you prove that it works, then you have to make it, and then you have to use it. So we will be able to prove potentially that a vaccine works, that it protects against infection or disease. That won't mean that we have an approval to use it, that we will have manufactured sufficient quantities at a sufficient quality to be able to use it in human populations. And finally, the question about access and equity. Will we be able to get enough of the vaccine out quickly enough? So each of those is a slightly different question. Widespread availability, certain parts of the world, maybe by middle of next year to the end, assuming again that we are able to show the proof of concept late this year or early next year.
No, that's a very important answer, because I think the rest of the world is looking at it. Dr. Kang, do you have a similar sense around when we'll have the vaccine?
I actually completely agree with Dr. Kim's timelines, but what I will add is that these are first generation vaccines. We should not expect them to be perfect solutions. We will wind up with vaccines that will work, will suppress disease, and hopefully to some extent have a secondary effect on suppressing transmission as well, but they will not be perfect vaccines. We are anticipating somewhere around 50% point prevalence being the mark at which WHO or FDA will approve a vaccine, but that is a point estimate, so the actual range is a bit larger than that. So if we look at approximately a third to half to 2/3 of disease being prevented, then that's not like a vaccine as a certificate to go back to life as normal. We have to understand that this is one effort to control disease. Other efforts will need to continue. Other research to improve treatments will need to continue.
Dr. Kang, Dr. Kim, this is possibly one of the most important shows I've done in my life. It really, it kind of sets the stage of what's to come. How does the world have to resume its business, and how do they get on with it? Because honestly, there has been so much of miscommunication around what's happening, and there isn't enough information out, and both of you coming on the show today and actually answering these questions has really opened my eyes as well, dramatically. So I really want to thank you both for coming on and, making people understand where we are at the vaccine development stage and by when approximately we'll have a vaccine. Thank you again. Good night and good luck.